people of France or the people of Germany and talk to them about the political union, because when effectively tell them that you need more Europe. When every time they hear more Europe, it's like Iraqis hearing the words from Westerners, but more democracy. They hide under the table because for Iraqis, when Westerners promise them more democracy, the bombs start falling out of the sky. So similarly, Europeans, when you tell them you want more Europe today, oh, they say, okay, more austerity, in other words, right? This is what you're telling us: less degrees of freedom, less democracy, because this is what happened as a result of having created the monetary union first, and then suffered the repercussions. So I don't think they have a plan on Ukraine. You know, I talk to people who genuinely think that Putin is the new Hitler. Genuinely think that, and they're really scared. So I said to them, okay, look, I'm not going to try to dissuade you. I personally don't like Putin much. But, if you think that Putin is the new Hitler, why aren't we sending troops to defeat him, to push him down the bunker, and to force him to commit suicide or to drag him to Nuremberg? If you think he's the new Hitler, you're not sending troops in there, okay? You're not sending any money. Not any serious money. I mean, they borrowed now 90 billion. It took them a year and a half to get that agreement amongst themselves. And that 90 billion has already been spent. What are they going to do next year? Borrow another 90 billion? They don't want to. It is not as if they're saying, oh, look, we have Hitler, the new Hitler, in the form of Vladimir Putin, and we're going to take, 500 billion, 600 billion and give it to the Ukrainians. So they have no plan for winning the war, for Ukraine winning the war. But they have no plan for peace. I have been struggling politically now for years, 4 years now, to put forward a peace and security agenda for Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. And every time I put this forward, I'm being demonized. I'm being painted as Putin's handmaiden, as Putin's servant, as Putin's client. So, anybody who dares talk about a peace and security agenda with Russia that would resolve the war in Ukraine peacefully is immediately thrown out of the room, demonized, taken to the cleaners, like people like me, and I suspect you as well. So, no plan for war, no plan for peace. Now, why would the Chinese or the Indians or the Mexicans, for that matter, take Europe seriously? Because the Chinese, the Indians, the Bangladeshis, the Africans, they want an end to the war in Ukraine the same way they want an end to the war in Iran, because it is impacting their livelihoods negatively. But they see that Europe doesn't have a war plan, it doesn't have a peace plan. So why should they care about Europe?
No, great question. Now, this is one of the things that confused me in Europe as well. The the yeah the suspending diplomacy essentially, like they have. But I feel like everything in Europe now is normative arguments. They keep referring to how they wish the world was instead of taking actual steps in terms of how it is. I just want to address what you said about the EU being now a cartel of big businesses, because what you're describing, I think, has been referred to as, the EU as a half-built house. That is because usually you want to have a political union, and then you can have a fiscal union, and then you establish a monetary union, along what the United States did. But we kind of the EU went the other way. First, a monetary union. Eventually, you would have some conflict or problems building up, which forces a fiscal union, which would then force a political union. But all of this would assume that the EU would be, as you suggested, born in crisis almost. And but here's the problem, though: you can't really sell, more Europe, as they call it, when it's not performing. So, given that we now have these problems which have been built up, um, and we have the war in Ukraine, we have the war in the Middle East, we have the United States losing interest in Europe, the banking crisis. What is the future now for Europe? I mean, is Europe done, or do you see any way out, any recovery?
Unfortunately, I don't see a way out. That's why I was prognosticating earlier that we are entering a very long period of stagnation, a very long period of decline. I think the historian of the future, especially the economic historian of the future, is going to identify the 2008 crisis as the beginning of a half century or even a century of European decline. This is, I hope I'm wrong. I really truly hope I'm wrong, but I don't see how it can be averted. I didn't go straight into that kind of pessimistic, negative mindset. Uh, Immediately after 2008, 2009, 2010, I struggled. I fought my corner uh, by tabling proposal after proposal of how that can be averted. There were many ways of doing it. Uh, James Galbraith and I and other economists had put forward the so-called modest proposal, and Stuart Holland, a British politician and economist, great economist. So Holland, Galbraith, and I were putting forward since 2008, 2009, the so-called modest proposal for the resolution of the euro crisis. It was a very simple idea that we should simulate a federation, given that we didn't have one, by using the European Investment Bank as a major pillar of growth and investment and research and development and so on, by means of bonds that the EIB, the European Investment Bank, would issue to be supported by the European Central Bank. That would have given us an opportunity to arrest the decline, the fragmentation, the bailouts, in order to create a space for having the conversation about the political and the fiscal union, which was necessary. And the powers that be said nine, nine, and nine. And then when I was finance minister, I put forward the same proposal along the same lines at ECOFIN, the economics and finance ministers meetings at the Eurogroup. The people from the European Investment Bank, including the German head, Werner Hoyer, were very enthusiastic about that. But the German government said no. And the people in the European Commission or around the European Commission that I mentioned before, people like Thomas Wieser and Dijsselbloem and so on, this bureaucratic, shadowy government of Europe, they were absolutely determined to kill these ideas and to impose austerity instead. Austerity is a bit like a huge dose of cortisone in a cancer patient. It makes it seems to work. The patient recovers a little bit, becomes more um, alive, but the cancer continues to do its evil work under the skin. And this is exactly what happened. So, they're celebrating the end of the euro crisis. The euro crisis never went away. In my country, for instance, even though the financial numbers are fantastic, if you're a financier, you're laughing all the way to the bank in Greece. You buy non-performing loans for 5% of their value, you sell them for 50%, you made, 10 times what you put in. You buy Greek bonds, well, the European Central Bank is supporting them. But all that has happened at the expense of 80% of the population sinking into greater misery now than ever, and negative net investment. So this is what they're doing. They're doing everything they can. They will change everything to make sure that nothing changes in a Europe that needs change, and that brings about what you and I have been discussing: this constant decline. We are falling behind everything. We are not producing green energy. Solar panels that used to be a great German invention, they're not produced anymore because the Chinese are producing them so much better and so much cheaper. And it's not that it's dumping; they have quite high profit rates. It's just that they have developed technologies that Europeans have not invested in. We can produce electric cars, so we produce leopard tanks instead. We have no investment whatsoever in what I call cloud capital, in algorithmic capital, in AI. So all the technologies of the future have bypassed us. And simultaneously, you have political dwarfs ruling the roost. You have Ursula von der Leyen that has been given a free reign, and she's doing things that are absolutely detrimental to the interests of Europe. Let me remind you that when Donald Trump was elected, she flew soon after that to Scotland and met Donald Trump, the president of the United States, in a golf course owned by Donald Trump, and signed a ridiculous trade deal with the United States, where Europe gave everything and took nothing. And not only that, but she made a promise, a solemn promise to Donald Trump. If you promise Donald Trump anything, you better deliver, because if you don't, then he gets really peeved, and he can be very nasty when he gets peeved. And she promised him 700 billion euros of investments into the United States. Now, the European Union Commissioner, or President of the European Commission, does not have that money to give. She doesn't have the budget. She cannot send a check for 700 billion to the United States to be invested in there. She doesn't have the mandate to do it, and she doesn't have the funds to do it. So she was making a promise that she could not keep, hoping that German industry would, fearing tariffs, shift production lines like BASF production lines, Mercedes-Benz, Siemens production lines, Group Diesen production lines to the United States. And this is, the head of the European Commission doing that. So when I say that we've entered the period, just like the Chinese went through 100 years of humiliation and decline, I think that's where Europe is. We are at the beginning of that.
Century humiliation. Well,
Century
that's
humiliation.
yeah. Well, it was only economic stagnation, but all of this economic collapse, political failures is happening also at a very critical time in human history with this new industrial revolution, the emergence of a, for the first time, a truly global multipolar world. It's not a great time to fall behind in this way.